were in, I was going to say Sicily. No, not Sicily. Where you based usually? I just remember Greek island.
Oh, I think we have no audio.
Yes. You might be still muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Perfect.
Okay, let me see if the headphones work this time. Am I still audible? No?
Yep, there is...
You can't hear me?
We
Okay,
can. There's
good.
kind of a background noise over there, but... Yep, it's fine.
Well, there should be less background noise with headphones, so. I can try headphones, no headphones. We can see which one works better. How does this sound?
It's okay. I think the second is actually better.
Yeah, the second one seems
Either one is
be-
good?
I much prefer not having white things in my ears, so.
It fits well because it sounds also better. So I think we're on the safe side there.
Okay. We have a good turnout, and I recognize some friends' names here.
Oh, that's good. Also keep in mind we have also people joining on YouTube, so this is half of the people here, the other half on YouTube. And so as you remember, we're going to have questions here. We will also have questions on YouTube, and I and a colleague were monitoring both, so we get both questions from both audiences. Which is also good for those joining us.
What is the hashtag for those people using Twitter?
We haven't thought about a hashtag yet, but let me think. How about Diplo_AI?
No underscore. DiploAI.
DiploAI. Okay, let me try again. DiploAI. I like that. Yes. So if anyone wants to tweet, the hashtag is DiploAI. Very good. Okay, I think it's almost time to start, just to alert you. I'm just waiting for our technical team to give basically the final go-ahead. Okay, and it is time to start. Very good. So it's my pleasure to welcome you to our web debate. And actually this is going to be the last web debate this year. If you're familiar with our web debates, we meet on the first Tuesday of the month to discuss new and emerging issues in diplomacy and to kind of discuss the new skills for the next generation of diplomats. The debates are organized by DiploFoundation in the context of the International Forum on Diplomatic Training. My name is Katharina Höhner. I'm a researcher in diplomacy and global governance with DiploFoundation, and I will be moderating the debate. So the topic for today is artificial intelligence on the international agenda. Where do we go from here? And I think this is an incredibly important topic to discuss because we already see it very much emerging and we start to see its impact in practice and on international agendas. So AI is of geostrategic importance, and we've seen some countries starting to invest heavily. We've also seen a number of countries launching or developing artificial intelligence strategies. And there's a clear sense that AI has economic and security implications. And with the US and China emerging as two of the AI giants, there are a number of countries who start to wonder, where do we fit in this, and should we develop an alternative, a different approach to AI? Lethal autonomous weapons is perhaps one of the most prominent examples when it comes to questions of artificial intelligence on the international agenda. Having said that, I think AI potentially impacts nearly all of the aspects of society and economy, so it is very likely to become a prominent topic in many other debates over the next years. I think there's also something else we should keep in mind. None of the AI-related developments are, in my opinion, inevitable or are following a given trajectory, which means we can shape this and we should take the opportunity to do so. In many ways, this requires a continuous conversation, like the one we are having today. So to have this conversation and to contribute to the debate, today we are joined by two key experts when it comes to technology, policy, and politics. We have Michael Nelson, who advises governments, companies, and other organizations on internet technology issues for Cloudflare. Before joining Cloudflare, Mike was a principal technology policy strategist in Microsoft's technology policy group. We also have Claudio Lucena, who's a professor at the Paraíba State University in Brazil, researcher at the Foundation for Science and Technology in Portugal, and a member of Diplo's AI initiative. So Mike and Claudio, thank you for joining us today. And I think a good way to start this debate is basically by asking, what are the key topics you see emerging related to artificial intelligence and beyond on the international agenda? And looking at this and both of you being keen observers of the impact of technology on politics, international relations, and diplomacy, do you see a way, in what way are old topics discussed in a new way? And in what way have you seen new topics emerging on the international agenda? So I would say, let's start with you, Mike, and then over to Claudio for just a couple of initial thoughts.
Well, the list is a pretty long one, but I would subdivide the topics between economic and military or intelligence related. I'll start with the economic. Clearly, there's going to be a real fierce competition in the private sector to develop new tools for artificial intelligence. We're seeing this already in areas to e-commerce, to some of the healthcare initiatives where people are finding they can dramatically cut the cost of doing analysis of medical photographs and x-rays and MRIs by using machine learning technology. But what's interesting is that that's kind of one application at a time. And so it's credit card fraud or trying to design a better chip. Those are well understood systems. What's more interesting is that companies are starting to combine different parts of their operation and trying to understand how the whole system works. So how a factory might work, or how a network of telecommunication systems might work together. And that's where things get a lot more complicated, a lot more interesting, and where the benefits get a lot larger, although we might not see those benefits. The consumer might not see them. So things like managing your fleet of automobiles or delivery vans, if you can do that 10% more effectively, you can become the dominant power in logistics because you're going to have a much larger profit margin. And so you're going to see companies competing to develop this technology. I think one of the big questions is going to be whether privacy laws in different countries, and particularly data localization requirements, get in the way in global services. If you're trying to provide e-commerce to a global audience, you want to be able to move data and combine that data and use AI tools. So that's one very interesting issue we're going to deal with. On the other side, on the military side, we have the potential here to have a lot of rhetoric similar to what we had with the missile gap and the space race and the concerns about which countries will dominate the development of computer chips. I think we're starting to see that already, where articles are being written about how the Chinese are ahead in artificial intelligence and what will this mean for intelligence collection, for designing weapons, for training soldiers. There's a lot of ways in which AI is already being used, and since defense departments and ministries tend to have a lot of budget, they've been really at the leading edge in a lot of these developments. And so whether it's a cruise missile or artificial intelligence for managing networks, the military has been pushing the envelope, and obviously that's going to be one source of a lot of it, one place we're going to pay a lot of attention in the coming years.
Thanks, Mike. I really like the emphasis on systemic effects and systemic implications. But let's hear from Claudio if there's a very different perspective, or if you agree with Mike in a lot of points here.
Hi, Catherine. Hi, hello, audience. Hi, Mike again. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks for this is kind of a continuous work we've been doing over our session for the IGF, and it seems we still got a long way to go, so we're not finishing this anytime soon. Thanks for the invitation. I do agree with Mike with that. And I think I might add here a topic from a different perspective. The question is also how traditional issues are being faced differently in the wake of this new wave of technology. And I also see in the international agenda a growing interest about the future of work and the future of jobs in a certain sense. That would not be a disagreement with Mike is saying, but rather a next point, which is particularly sensitive from the region I'm coming from the Global South. I'm a Brazilian, and I have my work has a Global South cut to try to understand how these effects could be a little bit harder or help increase or diminish the differences in inequalities, which is also an international concern in this sense. And in this perspective, what I've been seeing in the past year, I think I've been to a couple of different spaces in Europe, here in North and Latin America, and also from African and Asian friends, a growing perspective on including the youth on the debate about the future of jobs. Now, there is an impact which is coming due to the growing automation. Maybe this is a place, Catherine, for a small disclaimer here. I don't know how much the audience, and I also see a very familiar names here. I don't know if the audience is used to the regulatory debate on artificial intelligence in such a way. They're evidently interested. But just a small disclaimer here to see what you're looking for in this debate, because if you're here, if the term expression artificial intelligence drew you inside this room to discuss about the upcoming future for a conscious being other than a human taking over, this is a fair concern. There is a name in academia, there is an expression in academia that was coined to describe that moment of singularity. This is a very important issue. This is in fact an existential issue for mankind. Many good people are interested in trying to find ways to get mankind better prepared for that moment. But this is not going to be the most interesting room for you, because here we're interested in the smaller impacts that not a general purpose artificial intelligence, not a system that can substitute the human consciousness and actions for everything, but rather those narrower developments that make automation substitute human activities in a subset of those human activities. And those are exactly spread over what Mike just described, very much in economic and military effects. So that's what we're looking for here. And when we look at that perspective and that cut, from an economic perspective, there is a subset of the future of jobs in which we're worried, because automation is no kind of revolution in the ways of producing wealth was a zero-sum game, and this more intense moment of automation is not going to be a zero-sum game. So there's a strong concern about what and how we're going to deal with work in the future, and I would say a particular concern for because of the lack of proper education and access to those tools that we have in the Global South.
Thanks, Claudio. I mean, I can only echo that, and thank you very much for your disclaimer, because I think it's very important to stress that what we're doing here is not discussing a general intelligence that might be or not emerging at some point to singularity. We're discussing very specific applications done for very specific purposes, highly trained AI, highly trained machine learning applications. So I think that's very important to keep in mind. as we go on in this debate. And also thanks for mentioning the Global South and that perspective, and also questions like the future of jobs. We already had one comment from Glenn McKnight. Thank you, Glenn. And it goes in a very similar direction. He reminds us that General Motors made the decision to close old-style plants in favor of artificial intelligence in future plans for driverless cars, etc., etc. And obviously this is very big coming from General Motors, and I think this goes exactly in this kind of direction. This is also a good opportunity to remind our participants to please ask questions, share your comments. As we go on in the debate, I will bring those questions and comments into the debate and to the attention of our speakers. But so after your kind of initial perspective on this, let me push this a little bit further and ask a kind of mean or a difficult question, which is basically, if you had to name one, and just one, what do you think is the single biggest issue in terms of artificial intelligence, or the single biggest impact AI will have on the relation between states? And I know this is a very tricky question, but if you had to name one, and I think this is a very good exercise because then you have to narrow it down and you have to be very specific. So what is the single biggest impact you see from your work or your perspective? Mike, do you wanna hit us off again?
I will start, and it's going to be a very unusual answer. After I left IBM, I taught at Georgetown University in the Communication Culture and Technology program. And I think this is a case where the biggest impact and the biggest role of government is around the culture of innovation and a culture of optimism that could come if we use artificial intelligence, machine learning, neural networks in a smart way. And on the other side, if instead governments and industry focus on the negative and the nightmare scenario around artificial intelligence and machine learning and related technologies, we could end up in a very bad place. This is really an odd way of approaching the problem. I'm a technologist. I'm trained as a physicist. I tend to focus on the bits and the bytes and the mechanics. But the debate around machine learning and artificial intelligence has been so vague and so emotional that I think we could really lose several years in the development of the technology and the application of the technology because there's so much confusion and fear. You mentioned autonomous weapons. Skynet certainly has not been good for conveying a positive future where we can find good uses of machine learning and advanced technology. So I think governments have a real opportunity here to step up and paint a picture of what the world of 2025 could look like if we use these technologies effectively and creatively, if we don't try to constrain them in many ways that would hold back the opportunities, and if everyone understands how these technologies work. And so I think that's where some countries are going to jump ahead. When I worked in the White House in the Clinton administration in the early 90s, we painted a very clear positive vision of what we called the global information infrastructure. Even back in the 90s, people were a little concerned about the internet, and there were all these fears that this was going to be pervasive surveillance or that somehow one company would control the global internet. Well, we painted a picture with lots of small companies, millions of people creating websites, and steady improvement that could lead to better and better solutions in more and more areas. And that gave the U.S. a 2 or 3 year advantage. And it also gave people permission to try new things. When there's a positive sense of the future, people take more risks, people try new things, and that's what happened. And that's, I think, one of the reasons the Clinton administration was helpful in this area. It wasn't just about providing dollars and funding research and doing demonstration projects. It was providing an overall vision that really shaped the culture. The 90s were incredibly successful economically. And again, that was partly because there was a sense of optimism and 4% economic growth, driven in part by new technologies like the internet and the web. So that, again, it's not quite an issue, but it's, I think, the highest priority. Let's get government and business working together to paint a positive picture.
Okay, thank you. Lots of things coming to mind, but I first want to hear from Claudio.
So that might be also relevant for the others, and not in a broader way. We're working with an expression. The working expression for these technologies is much more confusing than enlightening. When we use the word artificial intelligence, that is the expression that drives people to the fear that Mike is mentioning. We always think of once again, let me use a more technical, general purpose as artificial intelligence, that we produce a conscious being which is not human, right? Once again, there is a very important discussion, but it's not what we have in our daily lives. This is not the purpose of this conversation. This is what happening. I would say we're much more worried about the small pluralities of everyday life than about the big singularity that might or might not come in the future. And then this expression drives us. Maybe it drives us in the wrong path when we're discussing automation over the amount of data we have nowadays. I already see that some of the questions refer back to the jobs issue. Maybe we're going to get there back. But my issue for the future would be, I think we're looking at for the near future a deepening of geopolitical alignment in the world, and I think artificial, not only technology in a global sense, but artificial intelligence might be driving that categorization or alignment of different states throughout the world. I think we had a very strong perspective of that path to be pursued from now on through Mr. Emmanuel Macron's speech in the opening of the IGF. He actually referred to a Silicon Valley approach to regulation as one that seeks more self-regulation and more let's say, freedom of innovation in a larger sense. Then he referred to the Chinese model of implementing technology. Of course, he was referring to content control by that moment, specifically to content control. Let's be very clear here. But I think it also takes us in the direction of AI and the use of automation too. And he mentioned then probably a third path for approaching regulation in this area, which would be the European way of doing regulation that he hopes that France and other partners would lead, which takes into consideration, I think that was a strong speech also for multi-stakeholderism, in the direction of strengthening multi-stakeholderism, in the sense that the state could not choose to be the strong hand or the strongest hand in this area, but that civil society could not be taken out of the equation. Now, that's clearly easier said than done. Right? The two approaches that are thriving now, they are strong for a reason, because they are easier to implement. You either make an option to let innovation flow and then try to manage the aftermath and the after effects, or either you take the state in control of this and then have a more controlled situation. And I think these first two models are already inspiring some alignment in the world. It does not change I wouldn't say that it would substantially or fundamentally affect the balance of the geopolitical balance in the world, but it will help us see some kind of realignment. If Europe finds a way for this, let's say, third path to work effectively towards the governance of AI, I think many other countries with similar characteristics or wanting to have a similar environment as a state could align to that. Otherwise, we're going to see the polarization towards the other two ways.
Yeah, Claudio, I think this is supposed to be a web debate, but we are agreeing on almost everything. I am reminded of an article that I wrote about 8 years ago for the European Institute, and it was called 6 Myths of Innovation. And in this article, I outlined 3 different cultures of innovation. In the East Coast of the United States, the slogan is ready, aim, fire. On the West Coast of the United States, it's ready, fire. Aim. And in Brussels, it's ready, study. I really do work anyway when talking. I also read that the Chinese seem to be adopting an even more radical version of the philosophy. What just happened with this gene editing experiment is very worrisome. And so I think we do have to push for transparency above all else. We have to make sure we know what different researchers are doing with AI. We require that they divulge it, but we have to have a sense that people share and that we see problems as they're developing, not after the fact. So I do think there's a need for it. Also, in this, you have a delusion about how much they can control. With technology like nuclear bombs, chemical weapons, you can actually control some of the hardware and the chemicals needed. Talking here about algorithms that can run on any computer or in the cloud. Some of them don't need much computing power. And it's hard to see how governments are actually going to control and shape the development of artificial intelligence or machine learning. And that's why I keep coming back to the really governments do have in research and education and in vision. And educating people on the difference between killer robots, decision support systems, machine learning, artificial vision. I mean, there's a lot of places here where a little bit of effort would really help clarify the debate. But we have to start debating something. We have to find something we disagree with. It even sounds like we agree that the singularity is the least important thing for us to be talking about here. I personally don't think we have to worry too much about the singularity, but other people do.
I think that there's a great consensus emerging, not just between the two of you, but also with our online audience. And this question, we need to actually sit down and, if not define, at least clearly specify what we are talking about. So there was a comment by Vladimir who said there's a lot of confusion out there, even very respectable media outlets are sometimes not very clear of what they mean by AI. And then he says we need to distinguish between AI applications and simply advanced use of databases and similar things. Avri Doria asks a very similar question, and it goes in the same direction. To what extent is AI still just an advanced programming technique that can be used for benefit or harm? And I think we're very much still at this juncture in time where we have to start thinking about these things. We have to start being very clear, but it's also very difficult at the moment, I think, to gain this clarity, and that's why we need to have these kind of conversations. I think that is very crucial. In that sense,
on the international agenda would have been quite useful, because it would have forced us to focus on a well-defined field where we understand what the topic means, and where governments are leading in the development of many of the applications. So my suggestion for your next debate would be to just talk about machine learning. And this is a new field. It's new because we have so much more data than we used to have, and we now have self-programming systems that can take all the data, change the program as the data changes, And mental challenge specify in the regulation that you have to be able to justify decisions that you make, whether it's about granting someone a loan or cutting off life support at a hospital. With the artificial intelligence, and particularly with machine learning tools, it's hard to actually say, this is the model we applied. And it's even hard to say that if we ran the model a month later, we would get the same result. And so that is what really is going to be a challenge for policymakers. Because they always assume that you have a system, you have a model, you have a decision to be replicable. But the whole point of these technologies, and machine learning is the best example, is that they can adapt as the situation changes. And that is going to be very confusing and probably lead to some interesting lawsuits in the future. So if you want to be guaranteed of a job, go into artificial intelligence law. The other thing I would add, though, is that one reason I think we're going to be able to resolve some of those questions is that AI also means augmented intelligence. And I think that's where the real opportunity is here. Very few companies and governments are going to turn over fundamental decisions only to some piece of software which they don't understand. And so I think in the real world, and certainly at Cloudflare, most of our critical choices are made by humans with really useful insights provided by the technology. Sometimes it's modeling software, sometimes it's machine learning, sometimes it's neural nets, but we usually have humans in the loop for decisions that will impact the bottom line of our customers.
Yep, I think Mike is touching an interesting point, Catherine, if you may. I think that feeling is a general institutional feeling all over the world. And if we can take one particularly important expression from the laws debate, from the lethal autonomous weapon systems, institutions are still looking for meaningful human control. That's the expression they use in the environment of laws, to convey the fact that that military forces around the world are, yes, looking for ways to automate more weapons or weapons in armed conflicts, but not to an extent that they will lose meaningful human control over them. Now, here's the issue. I think this expression is going to be very useful for us out of the military scope also, because all institutions, Mike just mentioned a couple of them, all institutions really do want to keep a man in the loop, or at least to keep the institution in the loop to some extent. If an actual person is not behind the decision-making process, but there is a person evaluating or assessing accountability behind the whole process. And the interesting thing is, I think this goes to one of the hardest issues for people who are going to be involved in artificial law activities, including artificial law from a legal perspective from now on, is to understand the nuances of these differences. Meaningful human control in the military realm means an amount of human control, means a degree of human control, means an intensity of human control. If you're talking about diagnosing diseases, you might be talking about something different, because ultimately, for the systems we have now, ultimately, there is a decision, and naturally a decision to be taken by a doctor. And if you're talking about public transportation, still another intensity, another degree of meaningful human control. So this might be the expression over which we're going to work now, from now on, knowing and bearing in mind this is one of the challenges of the generation that is going to work over with artificial intelligence as their, let's say, as their main working tool, to learn how to distinguish what amount and what is the nature of the human control that we are going to embed in each human activities from now on.
I think that's a really good point. And just to echo two things, it's very important to distinguish between automation and augmentation. So giving up human control, automation, augmentation, retaining some level of human control. And Vladimir actually developed a really interesting trinity for us. He talks about the human is in the loop, so a human is deciding. Human is on the loop, so there's the ability to still impact a decision or impact an activity that an artificial intelligence is carrying out. And third, human is off the loop, so the artificial intelligence is deciding autonomously. And this question of meaningful human control is something we came across already in the debate on lethal autonomous weapons. And as far as I'm aware, that was one of the key questions, and there was no proper solution or definition of what meaningful human control could look like. Mike, on this question of meaningful human control, do you have any suggestions for us or any ideas how we could begin to think about meaningful human control, especially in the sense when we use AI for augmentation, for helping us making decisions in politics and the social realm and the economy?
Well, I think that's where lawsuits and regulation will play a role in the United States. If a company decides that it's going to make critical decisions based solely on artificial intelligence or machine learning, and something goes wrong, there will be lawsuits and there will be questions asked, and companies will be challenged and asked whether they were following best practices. And I think that will lead other companies to want to avoid being in that predicament. And about how cloud blocking attacks from botnets that generate billions of phony messages. Our systems have to react pretty quickly, but there are going to be cases where we're going to have to act before humans check the individual specific case. It may be that humans will have seen this phenomenon 14 times and told the software that we understand this phenomenon. If you see it again, turn it off. Block this attack. But we're going to have to be able to justify that and make sure that we're not blocking a huge flow of traffic to a website that has just announced some incredible new sale on their e-commerce platform. That's always our challenge, is how do we block the bad traffic and not the good traffic? And as I said, I think we are already moving to the place where and sometimes we're going to have to let the machine and the models make the choice. But we have to be able to defend that choice, and we have to accept the consequences if the choice is wrong. The most interesting question is what happens when 3 or 4 different organizations are using artificial intelligence, and they're making choices that affect each other, and the system gets into some very strange loop and causes some problem that each company will be able to say, oh, no, it's not our fault. It wasn't our software that did it, but somehow the 3 softwares together, the 3 algorithms together, did something really, really dangerous. And that's when the interconnected world makes life very complicated. And that's where containing the damage from some of these potential misinformed decisions could be more challenging.
Definitely. I think this is also a good opportunity to bring in one of the questions from our participants, and this one is from Rola Hassan. And the question is, I think that ethics in AI is important to this debate. How can we develop a kind of ethics that is appropriate and up to the task? So one interesting thing is we looked at various policies and AI strategies of various countries. They're very much focused, as you would expect, on the economy and on security, but also on competition aspects, national sovereignty, staying ahead or getting ahead in this race to become proficient at AI and benefit from the advantages that people see. What is absent from these policies and national strategies very often is questions of ethics and the ethical use of artificial intelligence. So back to both of you, these are obviously very challenging questions, but I'm wondering, what is your response to Ola Hassan's question and the role of ethics in this debate, and why do you think we don't hear much yet, at least that is my impression from our research, from the side of countries and diplomats and national policy strategies?
Well, I can start. I've been involved in a project for the United Nations Internet Governance Forum. Each year we have a number of best practices forums that look at different aspects of Internet development. And this year we're doing a project that looks at the combination of the Internet of Things, big data, and artificial intelligence. And in our discussions about that report, we've had a very lively discussion on what is the proper way to address the ethical questions. And we have a couple ethicists on the team, and they're looking at the issue in their regular day job. But I've been quite outspoken in saying, wait a minute, we can't agree on what artificial intelligence is, and we certainly haven't agreed on a single ethical system. So if we're going to talk, let's talk about specific types of technology, whether it's autonomous weapons, autonomous vehicles, or in our case, it's mostly machine learning because we're looking at the data generated by the Internet of Things. And because we can't really agree on which ethical system to use, I think it's more useful to talk about human rights, which is certainly an ethical issue, but not try to come up with some grand ethical scheme that will define how we develop and use all the different aspects of artificial intelligence. So in Paris last month at the Internet Governance Forum, we had a very lively discussion about the report. And while ethics was mentioned, human rights was mentioned at least 5 times more often. And you can understand how to apply the different conventions on human rights to machine learning. I mean, you can start understanding, what's discrimination, how would this technology be used to deprive people of their liberty without justification. There's a lot of ways in which you can take the list of human rights and say, okay, we have to watch out how machine learning could be abused in that particular area. But I think if you start deciding that there's going to be one way to define ethics globally and everybody's going to do things the same way, we're not going to get very far. I'm reminded of the example with the autonomous vehicles where in the United States, if you ask somebody whether a robotic car should be programmed to kill an old person or a young person, if that was the choice, there's only 2 choices. You were going to take a left or a right, and you were going to run over a young person or old person. The Western view is usually save the younger person. They have more potential. They have their whole life ahead of you. In a lot of Eastern countries and cultures, the veneration of the elderly is so strong that surveys in those countries indicate that the car should be programmed to run over the young person because they haven't contributed as much. They're not as important to as many people. They're not as important to their community. So it's tough to say there's one ethical way to make the decisions that artificial intelligence systems have to make. The other thing to remember is we have to ask these machine learning systems the right questions. There's a famous story about how it's a science fiction story where over time artificial intelligence develops to the point where it's managing almost all of society. And the political leaders finally decide, hey, this is great. All of our problems are being solved. Let's solve the problem of pain. And let's make sure that no human ever experiences pain. So the robots decide the way you make sure no one ever experiences pain is to kill all the humans so there is no human left to experience pain. Seems kind of logical. Anyway, I did post a link to the report on our Internet of Things, big data, and artificial intelligence. And those of you who are interested might want to read that. There's a forum where you can add comments. We're looking for very specific comments. We're looking for big comments. We're looking for people who want to write some more and add to it. So thank you very much for listening for a very long, tirade.
Catherine, if I can take from that, I thought that this would be our first disagreement on this approach, because I was also part of the discussion, not as involved as I wished to, because I didn't have the amount of time. But Mike was really very much involved in the last design, in the last in this frame that the output had, and I happened to have listened and followed a lot of comments about ethics. In the embedding ethics in the design of artificial intelligence, and the global debate he refers to is actually it's a very fine description. There are let's say institutional initiatives that approach the governance of AI through an ethical perspective. Important ones like the international electrical engineering, the IEEE. The IEEE ethically aligned initiative, or ethically aligned report, is an initiative that approaches AI by attempting to embed an ethical framework in its development. It's not the only one. Many other initiatives in the world approach it from that perspective, from that side. But I do, in the end, I end up agreeing with Mike that when we have standards, it's not that human rights are absolutely objective notions. We do have our internal and cultural disagreements concerning human rights. But the thing is, they are a more stable, legal, enforceable framework than the one of ethics. It seems as if we're looking at the most stable solution, we would be definitely looking at an approach from human rights and not the more loosened one from the ethics. What I have from my last week in Berlin, I was in fact registered to attend 2 events, and it turned out as it would eventually impossible. Just stayed at the Humboldt University discussing the future of legal education, and a very interesting paper came out from my fellow Christian Jeffal from the Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society. And the paper he presented concerning aspects for the development of legal teaching in the future approached artificial intelligence not through an ethical perspective, neither from an ethical nor from a pure human rights approach, but from a perspective. The work is still a working paper. I think he's got to work a little bit more in it. But I think he manages to solve many of the gaps from the ethics approach while not reaching all the advantages of the human rights approach. I think he strikes a good balance. I don't know how he's going to take this discussion forward, how he's going to structure the final paper. It sounded to me like an interesting idea that could add up in the debate, because we're basically, and that was the debate of the report on the best practice forum for the Internet Governance Forum. The debate was rather between ethicists highlighting the value of the ethics approach in AI, and from the other perspective, people who believe human rights give a more consistent framework to approach the discussion. I think the sustainable development point is an interesting third path that we still have to see how it develops. I'm part of the right now. One of my hats is as a researcher for the AI, artificial intelligence inclusion from ITS Rio, and inclusion. We were tempted to think of it as an approach, but then inclusion is not exactly a framework, right? Inclusion is much more of a hope, and then we're developing strategies around the hope. But I do think ethics from one side, human rights from another one, and now this third door that was opened by Christian Jeffal might be interesting perspectives through which we can see the governance of artificial intelligence in the future. I would like to come back very quickly to one point Mike mentioned of transparency, and I also see that many of our participants are touching the transparency. Sorry?
Yeah, Claudio, I was hoping you could post a link.
To? To the article, you mean?
To the paper by Christian.
Definitely. The seminar was a workshop on the working paper, so we're incorporating the suggestions and the criticism into the papers. We might have something publishable by January. And it's interesting because Christian has also done extensive work in the sustainable development arena since his master's. So now he's in a postdoc and still looking at sustainable development now over the lens of artificial intelligence. 2 quick words on past topics: transparency, and I think this is a point that counts in favor of those national approaches that favor human rights and a more open transparency, because it's very important that we know which initiatives go wrong at this moment. When we're deploying artificial intelligence, it's very important for us to know what did not go right, how, and how not to repeat it. If national systems try to protect too much and control too much the innovation environment, they might prevent us from getting to know important experience that did not go well and did not work well. And I think we're in a trial and error phase. I think this is not very soothing for diplomats, but we are in that phase. And for us, it's very important to share what is working as the best practices, but practices that did not go very well are also important for us. And the last thing, since Mike mentioned artificial intelligence law, I'm sharing with you a paper from here in the chat from 2006, Professor Ryan Calo, who used to be by then in the Washington University, where he analyzes 9 cases in American law where robots are in the discussion. I mean, from 2016 up to now, there might be much more than that, but this is a very initial for the ones who are wanting to start discussing and start getting to know these issues. This might be a good kickstart.
Thanks, Claudio. Also, I'm going to pick up on one point you mentioned, which is these are very challenging times for diplomats and policymakers because it's very unpredictable. Lots of things are up in the open, and it's very much a time of test cases, of experiments to see where we can go. And on the back of this observation, let me add my last question for you, because time is not on our side, and it's already been a very rich debate. But what I would like to do is to bring it a little bit back to the focus on policymakers and diplomats and the kind of skills or the kind of mindset they need. So basically, how can diplomats and policymakers prepare for this? We touched on a lot of challenges: ethics, competition, the economy, potential rising inequalities between developed and developing countries. So how can they prepare for this? What kind of knowledge do they need? What kind of skills do they need? And well, what is the mindset you basically recommend for them to approach these issues as it becomes more and more relevant in their work? So basically, to end this discussion, your recommendations for knowledge, skills, and the mindset that policymakers and diplomats should start developing in order to address these vast amounts of issues as effectively as possible. And let's start with Mike, and then Claudio. Give us a list from which we can continue and then work from here.
I'll let Claudio start. Claudio can start because he's at the universities, which have a key role to play. So I'll let start.
Nice. Thank you very much, Mike. By the way, that was my contribution to the debate in Berlin, in the Humboldt. Skills, a roadmap of skill sets to address legal technology teaching, but I think it can apply very much to what we're thinking here. I think the first thing is interdisciplinarity. I think we have to widen the approach from a university standpoint, but also if we're talking about diplomats. I'm sorry that this is something I didn't test yesterday, if my neighbor was or was not going to start his renovation. So you might have been getting a couple of bumps. Interdisciplinarity in the sense that it is very important for us to know a little bit more than our single point or a couple of points of interest. It's particularly hard for legal professions. Law has been insulated for long and for strategic reasons, I would say, in its own jargon and its own environment. And I think if that is the choice from now on, we're going to have bad policy development and certainly bad regulations in place. The other thing is not only interdisciplinarity in the sense that you get to know other areas of knowledge, but interaction in the sense that you have to really, really speak to, interact with, exchange with people from other areas. I think this is pretty much the spirit of multi-stakeholderism. The ones of you who are used to working in a multi-stakeholder environment are a bit more used to it. When you get to an internet governance forum, it's very useful to interact with journalists, economists, technologists, engineering, governments, diplomats, economy, industry, academia. So this provides us with a richer experience. And one last, I would say, about more, let's say, fine technical skills. This is a very interesting debate. Coding as a skill has been promoted over the past years as a necessary skill, a necessary ability for the professional of the future. I wouldn't go that far. I don't believe that everyone. Avery has said somewhere here in the feed. If we're talking machine learning, we're talking in the end of the day about an advanced technique of programming. So I don't believe everyone has to develop those abilities as a set of personal skills, but I do believe that people have to understand the basics, sequence, repetition, condition, to understand how you build an algorithm, what are the basic structures, even if for machine learning this algorithm gets way more organic than that and doesn't work exactly as you would expect from a deterministic algorithm, but basic notions, so as to understand, to have a chance of understanding what happens during processing. I'm taking my experience from judges, for example. They do read financial reports. They do read technical evidence from engineering, because it's their language, that is written in natural language. Now, when we switch to code, it's not their natural language. So there is no way at all that any of them is going to go through a lawsuit or an analysis. And diplomats, I believe the ones that do not come from a technical background suffer from the same shortcoming. So not coding as a hard skill. I'm not saying that everyone should develop and learn how to implement, but learning how to read from other areas as an interdisciplinary skill, interacting with other areas, really exchanging from them, and learning how to read, or at least to understand how basic technological structures or basic processing structures take place, so that you can take part in the debate.
Mike, you're still muted. We can't hear you yet.
Okay, let's try that. Are you hearing me? Okay. So Claudio covered half of what I wanted to cover, and I fully agree that interdisciplinarity is incredibly important. The classes I taught at Georgetown were very cross-disciplinary: culture, technology, politics. But I think the most important thing that diplomats need to do in this debate is get specific. Rather than reading scary books about the singularity and these vague concepts of robots with brains, let's get specific. Let's look at specific companies doing specific things so that they can understand what the choices are and understand what the benefits are. So I would recommend that people read the MIT magazine, Technology Review. The Economist has also done some incredibly useful articles on artificial intelligence and machine learning and some of the choices we're making, particularly in the area of surveillance. I agree with Claudio that not everybody has to be a coder, but it is useful to have a coding class at some point in your career so you understand what the limits of software are. and what assumptions you have to make when you build a model, because code is not perfect and it's not going to be comprehensive. So understanding at a fundamental level what software does, I think, is very important. And then the last thing I would add, and I think Diplo is great at this, is you have to get a global perspective. And don't just go to Silicon Valley and talk to what people there are doing. Go and talk to universities around the world. Read broadly, understand the different ways in which people visualize the future. Because I just repeat again, vision is really important here. And having a vision that resonates with different people in different sectors in different countries is the most important thing we can do. So thanks for the opportunity. This has been great fun. It's always good to see Katrina and Claudio, and good to interact with several people online who were asking questions. So if anyone has any follow-up, let me put my email address here. The easiest one is my personal email, which is just mnelson@pobox.com. And I urge you all to get involved in the paper that we're doing for the Internet Governance Forum as well.
Well, let me add to that, Mike. It's always a pleasure interacting with both you and Claudio. And we had a similar kind of debate at the IGF just 2 weeks ago. And I think there's a lot more to be discussed. And this is it's always a pleasure hearing your ideas and your thoughts. So thanks to both of you, Mike and Claudio. It's been an absolute pleasure, and it's been a very rich debate, and we touched on a lot of important issues. But I think especially with these last couple of comments from both of you, we're getting more practical, and we're getting to a point where we can give very practical advice to policymakers and diplomats. And this is going to be extremely important as we move on from here. As Mike said, we will stay in touch. From our side, we'll follow up with the summary of this debate as well as the recording, so you can review it again, or you can share it with people who were not able to be here today. So thank you again, Claudio and Mike, and then thanks to our participants for a very engaging and also fun debate in the chat here. It's been a pleasure. So on that note, thank you, and I hope to see you again.
Yeah, hope to see you. Thank you very much.
Take care.
You too.